I never imagined that the man who laughed at me as he left the courthouse, the man who took everything from me, would be in for such a shock years later. In the courthouse hallway, an icy chill hung in the air, filled with whispered conversations and hurried footsteps echoing through the cold, distant atmosphere. I sat on the bench, clasping my hands together to stop them from shaking. Over the past few months, I had been drowning in a storm of emotions, but in this moment, everything came down to a single piece of paper. That paper needed my signature to end years of marriage, broken promises, and a love that had been corroded by ego and indifference.
Meanwhile, Robert stood by the door, casually scrolling through his smartphone with an air of arrogant confidence. His demeanor was that of a man already certain of his victory, having planned his celebration days in advance. For him, divorce meant liberation, a chance to reclaim his former self, unburdened by commitment. Jennifer's dedication as a nurse, her endless shifts, and the concerns he had dismissed as trivial had become nothing more than obstacles in his path. The court clerk emerged from the courtroom, calling out, "Robert Williams and Jennifer Jones."
I slowly rose from my seat, feeling the weight of this irreversible destiny. I felt no tears, no anger, just a deep exhaustion. I had fought so hard to save our marriage life. But everything fell apart when Robert lost sight of the value in my life and work. His pride and contempt finally severed the bonds that once held us together. We entered the courtroom where an expressionless judge glanced at us while reviewing our documents. To him, we were just another case file, mere paperwork to process that day. But for me, every word spoken in that room cut through my heart like a knife. The judge declared that the marriage of Robert Williams and Jennifer Jones was officially dissolved, and we were legally divorced, bringing down his gavel. The sound echoed through the room like the end of an era. Robert stood up first, carrying himself with the proud stride of a man closing a successful business deal. His demeanor was a stark contrast to my solemn silence. As he left the courthouse, he let out a deep breath and turned to me with a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, once filled with love, now gleamed with superiority and disdain. He remarked sarcastically that now I could devote all my time to playing hero during night shifts at the hospital, saying that was always what mattered most to me. I looked at him quietly, keeping my lips tightly sealed, refusing to answer. I would not let him see me break. For years, I had endured the sharp edges of his words, how he had glorified his position while repeatedly belittling my humble work. But I no longer needed to fight for his approval. Long before this final conversation, I had learned to recognize my own worth. He shrugged and continued, questioning why I clung to my nursing job, suggesting I was smart enough for bigger, more prestigious things, adding that everyone chooses their own fate. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace, as if a weight I had carried for years was finally lifting. I looked at Robert one last time, not with hatred, but with the clear understanding that he was no longer part of my life. I finally answered in a quiet but firm voice, telling him that yes, everyone does choose their fate, and I had chosen something more important than pride.
Robert let out a short, contemptuous laugh as he left the courthouse, carrying himself like the sole victor of this battle. Jennifer watched intently as he walked toward his car with an air of triumph. He pulled out his phone, eagerly contacting friends to arrange celebrations for what he considered his victory. In his mind, his monotonous life with Jennifer was over, and ahead lay a future filled with new adventures and opportunities. To him, being freed from the burden of a wife meant liberation from the woman he believed had been holding back his true potential.
As I watched Robert drive away, I felt all the emotional ties that had held me to him dissolving into thin air. The sense of freedom I experienced wasn't because my marriage had ended, but because I knew in my heart that I had done everything possible to make it work. For years, I had endured not only his contempt for my work, but also his dismissal of the unconditional love and support I had given him. When Robert's car disappeared around the corner, I took one last look at the courthouse before slowly walking toward the street. It was an ending, but it was also a new beginning. I knew my life wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to face it with the same dignity I had always maintained. While Robert was off celebrating what he called his liberation, unable to see beyond his self-centered perspective, I was heading to my night shift at the hospital. The hospital wasn't just a workplace to me, it was where I felt my true calling. As he immersed himself in his superficial life, I focused on what truly mattered: my work, my vocation, and most importantly, my inner peace. There would be no more mockery or contempt. The chapter with Robert was now behind me, and although the pain still throbbed in my heart, I knew I would overcome it. I sensed something new waiting for me on the horizon. It wasn't dependent on a man's approval, especially not from someone who had never understood my true worth.
Robert returned to his luxury apartment, where silence hung heavy in the air. Boxes still lined the corners, testament to his recent life changes that he had embraced with such anticipation. He tossed his keys onto the table, flung his coat over the sofa, and poured himself a glass of wine. This moment, which he had dreamed of for months, finally allowed him to savor the sweetness of solitude. The sound of the cork pulling from the bottle echoed through the quiet room as he settled into his newly purchased leather chair, a symbol of his fresh start. A deep satisfaction washed over him at the thought that he would no longer be bothered by Jennifer's demands, her endless hospital shifts, or her tiresome stories about patients. All his former burdens had vanished into thin air, leaving only freedom in their wake. The days that followed rushed by in a blur of activity. Robert reconnected with old friends, mostly successful businessmen like himself who shared his drive for achievement. His evenings were filled with lavish dinners and meaningless conversations at trendy bars. The city's gleaming lights seemed to mirror his new life's brilliance. He felt unburdened, reveling in a life free from constraints for the first time in years. One evening, while drinking at an upscale restaurant, a friend fixed him with a curious look and casually asked about Jennifer. Despite noting the subtle barb in the question, Robert merely shrugged and flashed an arrogant smile. "She's saving the world, one injection at a time," he replied with contempt, prompting laughter around the table. Conversations about Jennifer always led him down the same path. He believed his life had become more valuable by leaving behind what he had once considered trivial. Months passed in a whirlwind of parties, new women, and a calendar packed with engagements. Robert thought he had achieved what he had always dreamed of, a life free from emotional complexities and responsibilities. Long hours at the office no longer bothered him, instead, they became stepping stones to greater success. His ambition drove him forward, every action focused on reaching new heights. Yet despite all distractions, the quiet nights crept up on him. The lonely hours, far from the noise of parties and dinners, unsettled him the most. When the lights went out and he lay alone in bed, he could not ignore the growing emptiness within. One night, returning to his apartment later than usual after an evening out with friends, he found the city lights streaming through his curtains could not dispel his inner darkness. He sank into his sofa and turned on the television, but no program could hold his interest. The solitude he had once celebrated now felt more like a burden than a blessing. Jennifer's image suddenly invaded his thoughts. Though he hadn't thought of her for weeks, the memory now brought an unexpected discomfort. The image of her leaving the courthouse, her face calm and serene, stuck in his mind, replaying over and over. Robert twisted on the sofa, trying to shake off the feeling, but the scene kept playing in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop. What is she doing now, he wondered. Is she still working those endless hospital shifts? Has she met someone else? But he quickly dismissed these thoughts. In Robert's mind, Jennifer remained fixed as someone wholly devoted to her career with no time for love. The next morning, eating breakfast alone, thoughts of her crept back into his consciousness. For the first time, he realized he didn't feel as free as he had expected. He should have had everything he wanted: freedom, success, and women. Yet somehow, an inexplicable discomfort and emptiness kept growing inside him. His perfect life was beginning to show signs of wear at the edges. Trying to organize his thoughts, he decided to immerse himself in work. Meetings, business trips, and social events became his sanctuary. He thought if he kept his schedule busy enough, he could silence the whispering voice in his heart. Deep down, however, Robert was beginning to sense things weren't as simple as he'd believed. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing papers in his office, his phone vibrated. It was a message from a mutual acquaintance, announcing Jennifer's promotion and a special award recognizing her dedication and effort as a nurse. The first emotion that hit him was surprise, but it was followed by something deeper. It wasn't jealousy, but it wasn't indifference either. It touched something in the depths of his emotions that he hadn't acknowledged for a long time. He put his phone aside, but the news haunted him all day. Jennifer, the woman he had underestimated, was succeeding without him. And for the first time in a long while, Robert felt the sting of regret. Though he wouldn't admit it aloud, something inside him was beginning to change. Robert's life had become a series of meaningless events. Dinners, casual encounters, conversations, all felt more superficial than before. He pretended not to notice as the glorious post-divorce life he had imagined slowly lost its luster. Nights filled with alcohol and loud laughter now felt empty and hollow. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. One rainy afternoon, after finishing a meeting at the office, Robert stared out the window. Raindrops traced irregular patterns on the glass, and the sound of water hitting the sidewalk brought him a strange sense of nostalgia. The events of recent weeks passed through his mind like a worn-out movie. The faces of friends, the same jokes, the same places, everything felt monotonous. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was an invitation to a party that evening. Where once he would have accepted without hesitation, Robert left the phone on his desk, unanswered. For the first time, he felt no urge to escape into the next event. Something inside him seemed to be yearning for silence. He felt the need to stop running, to stop chasing the life that had slipped through his fingers. That night, he decided to stay home. He turned on the TV but quickly lost interest. Standing up, he paced quietly around his apartment, his anxiety growing with each step. Despite all his material possessions, he felt something missing in his heart. Looking around at the bare walls, luxury furniture, and expensive items he had bought to fill the space, none of them brought him the comfort he was seeking. He poured himself a glass of wine, then switched to whiskey, settling onto the sofa by the window. City lights twinkled in the distance, but only shadows spread within his heart. Suddenly, the thought crossed his mind, what if we hadn't divorced? It wasn't his usual kind of thinking, but that night, the question continued to torment him. Jennifer's face suddenly appeared in his mind. That serene expression she wore on the day of their divorce, her dignity intact despite his cold words, all came back to him with painful clarity. Robert tried to shake off the image, but unconsciously, he couldn't help thinking about their past life together. There had certainly been problems. Yet there was something in their relationship that now felt nostalgic. Though he would never admit it, somewhere deep inside he regretted losing it. The contemptuous words he had spat out after leaving the courthouse came back to him like a boomerang. Back then, he had been so sure he was right. He had been convinced that freedom was what he needed. But now, sitting in his cold, empty apartment, that longed for freedom felt like a silent prison. The following week, Robert tried to regain his composure. He went out with friends again, attended meetings, and kept busy. But conversations that had once been enjoyable now felt unbearably empty. Even praise from colleagues didn't fill his heart like it used to. Deep in his heart, he was beginning to face another truth, that the life he had built wasn't what he truly wanted. Sunday morning, drinking coffee on his terrace, he remembered again the message about Jennifer's success. Try as he might to ignore it, the news wouldn't leave his mind. He kept telling himself, it doesn't matter what she's doing, but something inside him protested each time. In the silent apartment, the walls felt close, and the air grew heavy. Though he considered going out to distract himself, he remained where he was, cup in hand, lost in thought. The emptiness within him grew with each passing day. He couldn't fully explain it, but the feeling pursued him relentlessly. That afternoon, he decided to take a walk in the nearby park. He wanted to clear his head, but more than that, he wanted to understand what he was searching for. Walking among the trees, seeing families and couples chatting on benches, he couldn't help but imagine what he had let go. As he passed by groups of people sharing joyful laughter, a faint nostalgia tugged at his heart. It wasn't for the laughter itself, but for the sense of togetherness it represented. He realized that despite all the parties and dinners he attended, he had never felt the genuine connection he once shared with Jennifer. The superficial surroundings had never filled the void in his heart since parting with Jennifer. Back home, he found himself staring at old photographs he had long avoided. They had been tucked away in the depths of a drawer. There was Jennifer, wearing her gentle smile. Even after exhausting shifts, she had never lost that smile. It was an expression that radiated pride in helping others. Robert placed the photo on his desk and couldn't look away. For the first time, he might have realized that the person he had undervalued had been his greatest support. The weight of regret began to take shape within him. One afternoon, returning from an important meeting, Robert received an unexpected message. Opening it without much thought, he found it was quite different from his usual work and event invitations. It was news about Jennifer. The message stated that she had received a significant award recognizing her dedication as a nurse. Additionally, her achievements had been featured in the local paper, praising her leadership at the hospital. Robert read the message twice. The first feeling that hit him was a strange unease. It wasn't jealousy or hatred. It was something deeper, touching a forgotten part of himself. As time passed, the image of Jennifer he had long undervalued began to crumble in his mind. He tried to ignore his feelings, pocketing his phone and heading to his car. But the thoughts wouldn't leave him. The vision of Jennifer receiving praise and respect stuck in his mind, occupying his thoughts throughout the drive home. How was it that the woman he had left with contempt was now shining without him? Unable to answer this question, he arrived at his apartment, placed his keys on the table, and poured himself a drink. But the small irritation deep in his heart wouldn't go away. He turned on the TV, trying to distract himself, but no program held his interest. Finally, he turned everything off, sank into his sofa, and stared at the ceiling, drink in hand, lost in thought. This wasn't the life I dreamed of. He had sensed this truth but resisted acknowledging it. He had believed that freedom would make him happier, that leaving Jennifer would lead to something better. But now, every time he thought of her, he was haunted by the possibility that he had made an irreversible mistake. As days passed, that feeling remained within him, refusing to fade. Robert immersed himself in work, meetings, and parties, but they had all lost their former luster. Conversations with those around him, once enjoyable, now felt empty. Everything that had once given him satisfaction now seemed like distant echoes. One night, at a gathering he would have once enjoyed, he was talking with an old friend. "She's really made quite a name for herself at the hospital," his friend remarked over drinks, a hint of admiration in his voice. Robert felt his stomach clench at those unexpected words. Forcing a smile, he tried to change the subject, but his friend's next words echoed in his mind. "She was always so dedicated, wasn't she?" Back in his luxury apartment, Robert could no longer suppress the thoughts he'd been fighting for years. Despite his efforts to erase Jennifer from his memory, he was finally realizing just how significant she had been in his life. For years, he had viewed her as nothing but an obstacle. A barrier to his ambitions, holding him back from what he thought was greatness. Yet every time he heard of her success, of her life flourishing without him, the truth struck him harder: Jennifer had never been the problem. Her face appeared in his mind again, but this time without the contempt he once held. He saw her now through new eyes, understanding at last. She wasn't the weak woman he had painted in his mind. She wasn't someone content with an ordinary life. She was strong, resilient, unwavering in her path despite his criticism and disdain. For the first time, Robert realized he was the one left behind. The following days became a blur of introspection and regret. Work, once his refuge, now felt hollow against the growing sense of loss. Standing by his penthouse window, he found himself revisiting memories of Jennifer he had long tried to bury. He remembered how she had supported him, been his rock when everything seemed to be falling apart. But he had been too blinded by his own ego to see it then. One Saturday afternoon, Robert found himself walking through their old neighborhood. It was an impulsive decision that seemed pointless, yet he felt drawn to return. The familiar streets felt both comforting and strangely foreign. The shops they once frequented, the tree-lined avenues they walked together, it all seemed to belong to another life now. He stopped in front of their former home. The facade remained unchanged, but everything else felt different. He didn't know if Jennifer still lived there, but just looking at the house brought a surge of nostalgia and pain. He stood there quietly, contemplating all he had lost. That night, back in his apartment, the TV droned in the background, but his mind remained trapped in the past. The emptiness inside him grew deeper with each passing day, and no amount of self-reassurance could deny that something within him had broken. The life he had chosen, a life without Jennifer, no longer brought him any satisfaction. Jennifer's presence no longer held its former allure. Instead, Robert found himself tormented by her strength, confidence, and ability to move forward without him. Though he never admitted it aloud, deep in his heart he began questioning whether letting her go had truly been the right decision. After weeks of anxiety and internal conflict, Robert finally crumbled under the pressure building within him. The small sting of regret had transformed into an unbearable presence in his life. He couldn't escape thoughts of Jennifer, her success without him, and everything he had once dismissed and abandoned. The nights in his lonely apartment grew increasingly empty, while his own mocking words echoed in his mind. One morning, Robert made an impulsive decision. He had been avoiding it, but now realized it was inevitable. He searched for Jennifer's number, still saved in his phone, and began composing a message. The words wouldn't come easily. Any apology seemed insignificant compared to what he had done to her, how deeply he had undervalued her. Still, he pressed send, hoping somehow to rebuild a connection with her. Hi Jennifer. I've been thinking about you a lot. Could we talk sometime? The response didn't come that day, or the next. Robert tried to convince himself she was just busy with work, but the silence grew increasingly heavy. As days passed, the lack of response became more painful for him. Every time he checked his phone, the blank screen reminded him that Jennifer was no longer part of his life. As frustration and anxiety mounted, he took the next step. He tried calling her directly. The ring seemed to go on forever, but always ended with voicemail. The words he had rehearsed in his mind never got to be spoken. He was struck by a feeling of helplessness he had never known before. Robert had always thought he was in control of his life, but now found himself at the mercy of Jennifer's indifference. His desperation grew with each passing day. He couldn't focus on work, meetings became meaningless, and praise from colleagues no longer brought the satisfaction it once did. His mind was consumed with the possibility of reconnecting with Jennifer. Her strength and success now seemed like a distant lighthouse he could never reach. Finally, he took the step he had been avoiding, deciding to see her in person. He knew which hospital she worked at, and that it was where she felt most comfortable and fulfilled. Robert headed to the hospital one afternoon. He approached the entrance with his heart pounding. His heart was filled with a mix of anxiety, shame, and a tiny spark of hope. He thought, if I can just see her, maybe I'll find the right words to explain how I feel. The hospital bustled with its characteristic chaos of people coming and going, life and death intersecting. Robert walked slowly through the corridors, searching for Jennifer's familiar face. After what felt like an eternity, he found her. She was talking with colleagues on the far side of a room. Her expression was serene, and she appeared completely absorbed in her work. Robert's first impulse was to approach immediately, but something held him back. He saw Jennifer laugh. It was a smile he hadn't seen in a long time. And it wasn't directed at him. It was genuine, radiant even amid the demanding nature of her work. Robert stood quietly at a distance, watching her. He found himself at a loss for words, unsure what to do.
I turned around and found Robert standing there. When our eyes met, I saw him freeze, as if all the air had been knocked out of him. I kept my expression neutral and unchanged. I felt neither anger nor joy, simply looking at him for a few seconds with the same calm demeanor I had cultivated over the years. Without a word, I turned back to my work. I continued my conversation with my colleagues, focusing on the tasks at hand.
A wave of shame washed over Robert as he tried to step forward, to say something, but his feet wouldn't move. In that moment, the truth struck him with devastating clarity that he no longer had a place in Jennifer's life. She had moved forward and built something substantial, something he had never bothered to see when they were together. Robert realized that everything he yearned for couldn't be fixed with simple messages or unexpected visits. He left the hospital feeling smaller than he had ever felt before. Jennifer's silent rejection cut deeper than any harsh words or accusations could have. He had his chance, and he had completely squandered it. Now all that remained was the weight of his wrong choices and the certainty that there was no going back. Jennifer's life, which he had once dismissed so carelessly, was now beyond his reach. After the hospital incident, Robert's days became unbearable. Jennifer's wordless rejection not only shook him to his core but forced him to face a reality he had been avoiding. The truth that he was no longer part of Jennifer's life. What once seemed like a possibility to reconnect and right past wrongs now felt like a permanently closed door. He kept replaying different scenarios in his head, thinking of what he should have said or done, but he couldn't change the hurt he had caused. Robert couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer. Every corner of his apartment reminded him of the emptiness he felt. No matter how many successes he achieved, every time he looked out at the city, his mind returned to the day of their divorce and the contemptuous words he had spoken with such confidence. Those words that had promised freedom now felt like daggers in his own heart. Still, he decided to try one more time, knowing that mere messages or chance visits wouldn't suffice. Robert felt he needed to face what he had done and hear Jennifer's words, even if they weren't what he wanted to hear. There was going to be a ceremony honoring Jennifer's achievements as a nurse. She was to receive an award at this event, a testament to her success and the respect she had earned from many. Robert decided to attend, not just to see her again, but to find an opportunity to speak with her directly. When he arrived at the venue, it was already filled with people. The murmur of conversations blended with soft background music. Robert moved through the crowd, searching for Jennifer's familiar figure. But he hadn't spotted her yet. As the program progressed, he sat in the back of the hall, his heart pounding as he watched one presentation after another.
When I was finally introduced, the room erupted in thunderous applause. I walked onto the stage with my head held high, smiling at the faces before me. I stood there, feeling a strength and confidence I had worked so hard to achieve. I could sense Robert watching me from somewhere in the audience, but that no longer held any power over me. I saw the realization dawn on his face as he witnessed the respect and admiration from my colleagues. I had not just moved forward, I had flourished, and I had done it entirely on my own. When I began my speech, I spoke from my heart about my gratitude to my colleagues and team. I shared my thoughts on the significance of nursing during these challenging times, something Robert had once dismissed so easily. My words carried the weight of years of dedication and genuine passion for my work. As I finished speaking, the applause grew even louder. I smiled, waved my hands in acknowledgement, and stepped down from the stage to rejoin the audience.
Robert knew this was the moment of truth. His palms were sweating and his heart was pounding like a drum as he searched the room for her. He finally spotted her in a quiet conversation with her colleagues, radiating a composure he could not shake. Drawing in a deep breath to steady himself, he walked toward her with trembling steps. Her tranquil demeanor made his throat tighten as he approached, knowing there was no turning back now. The elegant confidence she exuded was something entirely new to him, a strength he had never noticed during their marriage. Each step closer felt heavier than the last as he moved through the crowded reception hall. The soft murmur of conversations around them faded into background noise as he focused only on reaching her. He could see the subtle changes in her appearance, the way she held herself taller, the gentle smile that spoke of inner peace. This was a woman transformed, and the realization made his prepared words catch in his throat.
I was deeply aware of Robert approaching me, but my expression remained unchanged. I could feel the weight of his gaze, yet there was no anger or hatred in my eyes. The woman he once knew was no longer present in this moment. It felt as if nothing remained between us anymore. My life no longer had a place for Robert. And he understood that too. Despite knowing this, he couldn't help but try one last time. He called my name softly, stopping right in front of me. I looked at him briefly before responding. His name left my lips with a coldness I hardly recognized. I told him I never expected him to come. His forced smile barely touched his lips as he whispered that he wanted to see me. He said he had something to tell me. I paused, considering whether to continue our conversation. Finally, I nodded and moved us away from the crowd. I spoke quietly, telling him I thought we had nothing left to discuss. I explained that we had each chosen our paths. Robert admitted he was wrong, saying he now understood how much he had underestimated me. His apology felt distant, almost meaningless. I had already moved forward, and his regrets were no longer part of my story. I told him gently that I was no longer the woman he once knew. My words landed like an avalanche, making it clear our chapter was truly over. When he started to speak again, I stopped him. I wished him well, but made it clear my life had no room for what we once shared. Then I turned and walked back to my colleagues, leaving him standing alone.
In that fateful moment, Robert stood frozen as his deepest hopes crumbled before his very eyes. The bitter chill of the night seemed to mirror the emptiness consuming his soul. His last chance at redemption had slipped away like sand through trembling fingers. No more words of apology could bridge the chasm he had created. The silence was deafening, more painful than any harsh rebuke. With a heart heavy as lead, he slowly retreated from the scene. Each step was a testament to his profound loss. The dreams he once held so confidently now lay shattered at his feet. No opportunity remained to reclaim what he had so carelessly destroyed. The darkness of the night wrapped around him, a cold and unforgiving companion. His heart ached with the realization that some mistakes can never be undone. Emptiness, a vast, consuming void, was now his only true companion. And so Robert disappeared into the night, a broken man haunted by the ghosts of his own making.
I closed the event venue door quietly, knowing there was no point in looking back. My heart had already detached from Robert and our shared past. As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of complete liberation. I turned on the radio and drove towards my new home on the outskirts of town. The house was nestled among trees, a sanctuary of peace I had longed for after my divorce. Here, I discovered parts of myself I could never fully explore during my marriage. Soft garden lights welcomed me, symbolizing my new beginning. Everything about this life felt like a fresh start and quiet renewal. When I opened the door, Kenneth greeted me with a warm smile from the kitchen. Unlike Robert, Kenneth understood my work and valued every small sacrifice I had made. He celebrated my successes without judgment or criticism. He asked me about my evening while pouring 2 glasses of wine. I smiled and said everything had gone well, my voice calm and relaxed. It had been an interesting night, I told him. Kenneth already knew about Robert being at the event and had given me the space I needed. I had moved beyond my past emotions and was determined not to let them affect my present. During dinner, we discussed future plans, potential travels, and upcoming projects. Our conversation flowed with a lightness I had never experienced before. There was no pressure, no criticism, just a pure and comforting connection. After eating, we cuddled on the sofa under a soft blanket. When Kenneth whispered something in my ear, I laughed spontaneously. My laughter was a testament to the happiness I had found after years of internal struggle. I no longer felt the need to look back or long for what once was. As time passed, I realized something profound about my journey with Robert. Our chapter had ended long before he ever apologized, deep within my own heart. The true conclusion came when I decided to live for myself. I found peace among people and places that truly valued me. With Kenneth by my side, I developed a career that allowed me to shine. I discovered a path that was entirely my own. The wounds I once thought would never heal had finally mended completely. My life continued with a steady rhythm of purpose and passion. At the hospital, I remained dedicated to my work, finding joy in caring for each patient. My colleagues respected me, but what mattered most was the personal satisfaction of making a difference. During weekend getaways with Kenneth, we would escape the city's noise and reconnect with what truly matters. While walking through beautiful landscapes, I often reflected on how dramatically my life had transformed. I had changed, rediscovered myself, and become stronger than I ever imagined. I remember telling Kenneth how life takes us down unexpected paths. He understood me completely, having witnessed my growth and personal evolution. He was proud to stand beside me. We would often discuss how important it was to keep moving forward. For me, the past was no longer a burden but a learning experience. I learned not to be trapped by others' mistakes or unchangeable circumstances. I discovered that the power to rise again came from my own choices. Returning to the hospital after our travels, I felt grateful for the path I had chosen. The long days and endless night shifts held meaning because I loved what I did. What was once a source of conflict in my marriage was now simply a reflection of my ex-husband's limitations. My life had become deeply fulfilling. My story with Robert no longer carried pain or significance. It was an important chapter, but now I valued living peacefully, surrounded by people who truly respected and loved me.
In the depths of his lonely apartment, rain pelted against the windows, mirroring the desolate landscape of Robert's inner world. The rhythmic drumming of raindrops seemed to echo the emptiness consuming his soul. Since his last encounter with Jennifer, he had been unable to escape the haunting void that surrounded him. All the distractions that once brought him joy now felt meaningless and hollow. He sat on the edge of his bed, surveying the room with a defeated gaze. The apartment that once symbolized freedom and a fresh start now felt cold and lifeless. The walls he had once proudly believed would represent his liberation now felt like a prison. The initial satisfaction of his divorce had completely vanished. The emotions that had driven him to discard everything had disappeared without a trace. Robert tried to focus on work, but each task felt increasingly burdensome. The client meetings that were once the center of his life now held no interest. His mind constantly drifted elsewhere, distancing itself from business and empty conversations. The nights were especially difficult. The silence enveloped him, slowly revealing the crumbling foundation of everything he had built. His final conversation with Jennifer replayed repeatedly in his mind. Her calm and resolute expression was a shock he couldn't comprehend. He had approached her with hopes of reconciliation, but discovered a woman who no longer needed him. What tormented him most was realizing she had moved forward while he remained stuck in the same place. Loneliness had finally cornered him, leaving no escape. Robert had believed career success, financial comfort, and freedom would fill his emptiness. Yet as time passed, he began to understand that what he had prioritized held little real value. Meanwhile, Jennifer, the woman he had once dismissed and belittled, had built a fulfilling life without looking back. One afternoon, while aimlessly sitting in his office, the phone rang. It was his lawyer discussing financial matters, but Robert barely listened, lost in his regrets. The lawyer sought his investment advice, but Robert replied disinterestedly, "Do what you want," before abruptly hanging up. Emotional exhaustion overwhelmed him. The decisions he had once confidently made now felt like chains binding him. His work, which once provided satisfaction, had become a monotonous daily grind. He was beginning to recognize the lack of depth in relationships he had cultivated over years. In truth, he was completely alone. Not just from a lack of people, but because he had deliberately pushed away those most important to him. That night, Robert drank more than usual and collapsed onto the sofa, surrender written across his weary frame. The television flickered with images, but Robert's eyes saw nothing, and sounds echoed distantly. He closed his eyes, desperately wishing he could turn back time. Reality stood before him, merciless and unyielding. "There's no going back," he whispered to himself. He understood that the life he had shattered could not be repaired by belated apologies. Slowly, he rose, stumbling towards the window with unsteady steps. Outside, city lights shimmered as always, but they resonated nothing within his hollow heart. The scene he once took pride in had become nothing more than an indifferent backdrop. He remembered that night when he believed he had everything. The version of himself who thought life without Jennifer would be better. Now, he was painfully aware of the enormous cost of his self-centered choices. Weeks passed, and Robert realized he no longer possessed the strength to live as he once did. The work that once defined him offered no comfort. Meetings that once sparkled now felt tedious, and his presence gradually faded within the company. Decisions he once confidently made were now postponed, and people began to notice his growing indifference. One morning, after a sleepless night, he received an unexpected phone call. His former business partner was withdrawing from their joint project. Robert couldn't muster any reaction as the news settled over him like a heavy cloud. In the past, he would have fought fiercely to protect his position and secure success. But now, he lacked even that basic motivation. With time, he began distancing himself from everything he once considered important. The professional achievements that once defined his life now held no meaning. People around him started drifting away. Perhaps sensing his growing listlessness. Or perhaps because he no longer made any effort to maintain even surface-level relationships. The circle that once brimmed with power and success gradually disintegrated. Robert had never felt so alone. Nights in his apartment stretched endlessly, and office days became unbearable. The man who once thought himself invincible was now just a shadow of his past. As his life crumbled, he was forced to acknowledge a painful truth. "I lost what mattered most a long time ago." Regret consumed him as he sought some way to make amends, knowing it was far too late. Jennifer had moved forward, finding peace and happiness. Meanwhile, he remained trapped by his own ego. The time he had wasted could never be recovered. And the price of his choices was manifested in the loneliness he now inhabited.
I looked back on my life with a quiet smile, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. My hard work and dedication to nursing had been recognized when I was awarded the Regional Nurse of the Year award. Within the hospital, I had grown into a role of significant leadership, something I never could have imagined during my challenging years with Robert. My relationship with Kenneth had blossomed into a true partnership, built on mutual respect and unwavering support. We had created something beautiful together, a connection that was so different from my previous marriage. Each day, I felt grateful for the path I had chosen and the strength I had discovered within myself. The awards and professional achievements were wonderful, but they paled in comparison to the personal growth and happiness I had found. My journey had taught me that true success was not about external validation, but about staying true to myself and my passion for helping others. Looking back, I realized how far I had come from the woman who once felt trapped and undervalued. Now, I stood confident, respected, and most importantly, at peace with myself.
One man's empire crumbled in the shadows of his own misguided choices. Robert watched helplessly as his once brilliant career faded like a distant memory. The professional brilliance that had once defined him now lay in tatters. Colleagues who once sought his counsel now deliberately avoided his gaze. Friends who had once clustered around him for networking and opportunities slowly drifted away. His social circle, once vibrant and powerful, now resembled a desolate landscape of broken connections. The very success he had sacrificed everything to achieve was slipping through his fingers like sand. His empty lifestyle became a stark reminder of the woman he had once carelessly dismissed. Jennifer's value, the strength and dedication he had once belittled, now haunted him with painful clarity. Each passing day revealed the true cost of his arrogance. The man who believed he could control every aspect of his life now found himself a prisoner of his own making. His professional achievements, once a source of pride, now felt hollow and meaningless. The world that had once revolved around Robert's ambitions had irrevocably shifted. And in that painful realization, he understood the devastating consequence of underestimating a truly remarkable woman.
I had completely severed ties with my past, finding strength through overcoming immense challenges and rediscovering myself. With Kenneth and our new family, I was able to fully express my passion for nursing and my deep commitment to caring for others. Occasionally, memories of those difficult years would drift through my mind, but they no longer held the power to wound me. Instead, they became proof of my growth, silent testaments to how far I had come. I often told myself that life is a series of choices, and what truly matters is respecting and loving oneself. Robert's final attempts to contact me revealed his growing isolation, but his words of apology meant nothing to me now. I was moving forward, building my own life on my own terms. On a bright, clear day, I found myself speaking to young nurses at the hospital, sharing wisdom born from my own journey. I told them that their value is not determined by anyone else's approval, urging them to believe in themselves and chase their dreams. My words felt like a message to my younger self, a healing balm for old wounds. Driving home with Kenneth that evening, I gazed out the window, reflecting on life's unpredictable paths. True strength, I realized, lies in the courage to keep walking, no matter the obstacles. Robert was no longer even a footnote in my story. I was free, truly happy, and that was my real victory.